All right, so we just walked through how to create a React app from scratch by just installing the libraries and creating the basic architecture of it, which included that public directory and the source directory, creating that index.html file with a single div in it that was the root div, which we will be injecting the JSX from the React. Also, we have the source, which utilizes the React DOM library, which tells us where we want to actually render the JSX or the components inside of our index.html file. All right, so now let's actually create a React app from scratch, but I just kind of want to go over a couple of things first. So in React, you might hear of these things, these libraries or these words called Babel and Webpack. So Babel is literally just a JavaScript compiler that converts ECMAScript 2015, like newer versions of JavaScript, backwards. It makes it backwards compatible to older browsers or environments in general. So it just makes everything, doesn't matter what JavaScript version, which ECMAScript you are using, if it's really old JavaScript or if it's really new JavaScript, the Babel just makes everything backwards compatible. And then there's Webpack, which is just a bundler that just literally bundles all of your assets, like including JavaScript, images, fonts, just a video, whatever, into a single bundle file. And that bundle file executes the actual code. You don't really need to worry about any of this right now, but just know that in the future, if you ever encounter this Babel RC file, it looks kind of something like this. And then a Webpack file, which is a config file that looks something like this. You don't need to know explicitly what all of this does yet. And you don't need to build any of this stuff from scratch. React scripts kind of helps us do all that stuff for us. Any questions? All right. So let's go ahead and build a React app from scratch. So I'm in this directory called Intro to React. What is the command to create a React app from scratch?
npx create React app, name of the app.
All right. npx create React app, and then let's just call it, say, my app. So npx is similar to npm. It just allows more functionality. Create React app is an actual command. So if I wanted to go to create React app, react.js, react.js.org. This is the actual official documentation for it. React has excellent documentation, similar to that of Django, but it's not as robust. It doesn't have as many things to worry about as Django does, because it's a lot lighter compared to Django. So just here is the tutorial, and just here's the documentation. Where is it? I want to see if there's the GitHub. So right here, here's the actual GitHub page for it. Again, it's created by Facebook. Right here, you can actually see the actual commands you can run. So create React app. I'm going to call this one just my app. And it's going to take a long time to install everything. So it just created my app right here. It's got that packages.json, and as it installs everything, so it looks like it's installing React, React DOM, React scripts, and it's got some CRA template. I don't even know what that is. Questions so far? Yep, go ahead.
So we're gonna run npx each time when we want to create app, right?
Anytime you want to create a React app from scratch, yes, you'll be running npx. Correct.
Is that the reason in the previous lesson you were saying we'd never have to do it this way again? Is that just so you were showing us the structure of it?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So I was just showing you that you can build it from scratch just by installing the packages and having the architecture, like the public file and the source directory. But you won't have to do that from scratch anymore because this Create React app installs everything for you, including the folder structure and everything else.
What would be the command if you already had a React app? Like if you downloaded one off GitHub, would it be?
So yeah, we'll go over that once this gets installed initially, and then I'll kind of, if you already have a React app that you fork or clone it down from GitHub, I'll show you kind of how that works.
Thanks.
Yep.
Why does this take so much longer than, say, installing Django when React is something lighter than Django?
I think it's just because of all the libraries all the dependency libraries that it has. And also my computer is a little slow, I think, because I know, I think when Quinn did it, it was a lot faster. So so everything's all done. Zero vulnerabilities found, created git commit, success. Here's where it's located at. And it provides several scripts that we can run to start the development server, build the static files for production, or run the test server. So I'm going to clear the screen, and now I'm going to actually CD into my app. And I can list everything out. I've got my node modules, got this package.json lock, this package.json file, this public and source directory. So if you were to download something off the internet, like a React app off the internet, it more than likely won't include the node modules. So that won't be included, but it will include a package.json file. And the package.json file, think of it as, do you remember the requirements.txt file for in Python where you wanted to install the packages or libraries or modules associated with an app? You'd run pip install or pip-a or pip install-r, whatever requirements. The package.json file is the same thing, equivalent. So if you were to download a React app off the internet, it more than likely wouldn't be included. The node modules wouldn't come with that, but there'd be a package.json file included with that, which would include all the dependency libraries that the app requires. So if I were to download this right off the internet, I would run npm install, and it would install all of these libraries. So that's how you would get a React app up and running if you were to download it from a GitHub. Did that help answer your question?
Yeah, that answered it perfectly.
Cool. Awesome. And
Do you have to be in the same directory as the package.json for npm install to work?
Yes. Yep. And if you're to run npm install or run npm init outside of this, it can run into issues. And I think other people, if you had a node modules outside of this package, up one level, and tried to run it, it might conflict with one another and it might not work. So just make sure that the node modules in the package.json file are located within the actual React app that you want. All right. So cool. We just created a React app. That's great. I kind of want to show you why React is so popular in these front-end libraries. So here's Airbnb. Airbnb uses React as its front-end framework. And if you were to build this page from scratch using Django, for example, you would have to create HTML, whether it's a divs or HTML files for each and one of these individual locations, like Saugatuck, New Buffalo, Wisconsin Dells. So each individual, you would actually have to create a section in HTML that would correspond to each one of these. Well, in React, you only actually have to create one of these, which is called a component, and just copy that component over 8 different times. And all you have to do is pass in different data into that component to make it more dynamic. So you'd pass data like Saugatuck, and maybe the hour time or the drive time in there. And you can see this. So if I'm opening up here, and I can come over here, this is React Dev Tools, which you'll be downloading shortly. So in here, if I click that, let's see, I can see actually data in here. So with styles, you can literally see the props, the context data. I just want to see if I can find it first. Value. Oh, in view maybe? Where'd it go? There we go. So you can literally see the state of this component right here. It's got some, attributes about whatever, like this is probably CSS attributes, and this time, I don't know what that is. That actually might be associated with like our drive. But yeah. So you can see it's got it has props being passed in. So there's props and state. We have on change handlers. We have class names, etc. So literally one component can be created and just replicated 8 different times. And so it doesn't require you to write 8 different HTML tags and all that stuff. Same with here. Like all these are probably the exactly same component. Does anybody have any questions? Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering how that differs from using like the in HTML like code blocks, like where you can like add elements to a list or something.
Add elements to a list.
Well, like when you have to repeat something like those icons, you would basically be like, okay, what cities are in my database? Let me go traverse the database, get that dictionary, and then pass that to the HTML thing that, for each city in cities.
I mean, you can do it like that, but with like React, the components will update in real time. So if any data changes from like a user input, it can like update in real time, such as like the form and all that.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm gonna go ahead. So again, React, oh, come on. So this is, again, just a page of Airbnb. So in React, there's some things called components. Components let you split the UI into independent user reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. So each piece can operate in a very unique way from a different piece. So one component can operate or interact in a certain way than another component. So there's something called class-based components, which you should be kind of familiar with, and functional-based components. And each component can have data in it, such as state, which is explicitly local to that individual component. And then there's props. Props is passed down from a parent component down to a child component. So props is passed into the component, and you can't mutate it. It always stays the same, that data. So, and there's another thing called state. State is an object that stores data that is local to the component. We kind of already went through this. Similar to props, but is only local to that specific component. And then there's JSX. It looks exactly like HTML, but it's actually a syntax extension to JavaScript. Allows us to write JavaScript in line with HTML, kind of like Jinja 2 in Python. What questions do you have about components, props, state, and JSX? All right. So in this example, in this screenshot of Airbnb, for example, here we have 3 different components. There's obviously more components on this page, but I just split these out because these are probably most components that are being reused in this page. So here we have component 1 that has dates. Component 2, it has this thing called hiking with 27 experiences. And component 3 is this card that says day trip, where it's at, experiences Mount Rainier, has like how much it costs per person and how long that experience lasts. So you can actually take that component and replicate it multiple times. And all you're doing with that component 2, you're passing different data into it to display, instead of hiking, it's going to display agriculture. Instead of 27 experiences, you might pass in some props or state or some data that only shows 4 experiences. Likewise with camping and etc. Same with component 3 and component 1. Component 1 has a tag called dates, guess, price, time of day, language. It's literally just being passed in different data to display this information, as well as when you click on it, it might execute a function to do something else. What questions do you all have? And again, each component is literally just a class or a function, depending on whether it's a class-based component or a functional-based component. So here's, again, component 3. Component 3 might consist of multiple components within itself. So for example, you might have a favorite icon with this heart. You might have a card image component that just displays this image. You might have like a card main, which just has various information about the card, such as the guided hike, what type of experience is it, hike the gorgeous trails of Washington. And it also might have like another component called star rating, which just all that component does is, you know, the only data that's passed into that star rating component is, you know, how many people have gave it reviews and the average of all those ratings. And that's the only thing it displays down here. Any questions about this example component? And again, when we get into class-based components, props is only passed down. So we get in kind of like a tree. So component 3 renders the card image component as well as the card main component. So it renders this card image component, and it also renders this card main component, for example. And then inside the card image component might render the favorite icon. And likewise with the card main component, it might render the star rating component. And the props, which is just data from component 3, is passed down to card image, which is also passed down to favorite icon. That's one way we can pass data downwards. We can kind of show you, visually speaking, what that looks like in the code base from like the return statement. So the component 3 literally just returns the card image component right here, as well as the card main component. And then the card image component just renders, you know, the favorite icon and maybe some more elements like an image or whatever. And then the card main component might render the star image or the star rating component. Questions do you have? All right. So we kind of went through this already. There are 2 ways to create a component. There's the class-based component and functional-based component. React App initially started out with class-based components. So it always had class-based components and functional-based components. However, class-based components back in the day were only, those components were the only components that you were able to create state in. So if you wanted to create state, you only use a class-based component. And if you wanted to pass that state down, you were able to pass that state down to a functional-based component. But functional-based components are generally known as dumb components, didn't use state in any way. It only utilized props. However, going forward, JavaScript or React is kind of gearing away from class-based components and wants to be purely functional-based or utilize functional-based components. And with that, they had to create a way to access state in functional-based components. So that's why they created the useState method for explicitly used in functional-based components. So over here on the right side, we actually have an example of a button component or button class-based component that utilizes state. So declaring state in a class-based component, you just declare the variable called state. And again, state is a reserved keyword in JavaScript or in React. Same with props, the reserved keywords. And state in a class-based component is always an object followed by whatever keys you want, and essentially whatever data you want to be stored in here. It also has this render method, which always renders whatever JSX you want. So it renders and then it just returns the JSX. Whereas a functional-based component, to access state, we have to use this useState method. So this is how we declare state in a functional-based component with this useState method that has an initial value of the state, which is count, and then it also returns a method setCount, which actually changes state. Any questions on class-based components versus functional-based components? All right. So we're going to get in a component's life cycle. Did Quinn cover like the life cycle in React components?
I don't think so.
Okay. So there's a component's life cycle. There's multiple triggers or things that happen in a component's life cycle. So there's mounting, there's updating, and there's unmounting. So mounting is when a component initially renders to the DOM for the first time. So when it initially renders to the screen, that's when it's mounted. Then updating is when a component changes state or props. The component may or may not re-render. So for example, if you click a button to increase the counter, that when the state changes from like 1 to 2, it might update the component. So the updating essentially re-render. And then there's unmounting. It's just essentially when the component is removed from the screen or removed from the DOM. And there's these things called these built-in methods in class-based components called life cycle methods. And these are strictly used in class-based components. And these methods trigger at certain points in the component's life cycle. So each class component has several life cycle methods that you can override to run code at particular times in the process. So there's component did mount, should component update, component did update, and component will unmount. There's other ones as well, but those are kind of the main ones. And we'll cover this again later on in the week or even next week. So this is kind of advanced right now, but we will cover this, but it won't necessarily be today. I just kind of want to show you or give you all this information, and then we'll slowly add on to it. So the first time you see this, it won't be a surprise. Any questions about component lifecycle and lifecycle methods? So again, these are automatically executed. If you call them in your component, they'll automatically execute at certain points in the component's lifecycle. So here's literally a component's lifecycle for a class-based components. Again, these are just explicitly for class-based components. So when a component is initially mounted in a class, the first thing that's ever called is the constructor method, the constructor function. Also in Python, the dunder init. So that is always the first thing that's called when that class is created. And then the render method is ran. So if I come up here, so if I had a constructor up here in this class, that would first run, and then the render method would run. And then the final method that would run on its initial mounting is a component did mount method. So you'll see the component did mount method a lot in class-based components. And then if a component updates, so if state changes, we have a method called should component update. And that is a method to say for the user or for the developer to be like, hey, should I update this component or should I re-render it in case, or should I re-render this component based off of any data change? And then it also runs the render method again, because again, it always runs this render method when you're updating or mounting. Then it also has a component did update method. So that's the actual order of mounting and updating. And then unmounting, it just component will unmount, and that's the only thing that runs. And you can, go ahead.
So I was going to ask, so the like the component did mount and the component did update, those will execute after the page is like fully loaded and like all your promises and stuff are returned?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure if they'll actually run after the promises are returned. I don't want to say that because once we get into utilizing an API, these still will execute, but before all your data is necessarily received.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly what I was kind of asking about.
Yep. All right. So this is explicitly for class-based components. But again, I said, React is kind of moving away from class-based components, and it wants to implement strictly using functional-based components. So they have to replace these lifecycle methods with something for functional-based components. And that's where hooks get involved. And explicitly, the use effect hook is the equivalent to all of these in a functional-based component. So hooks allow you to interact with data at different points at a component's lifecycle without using class-based components. You can now access data, state, or props using functional components. So the hook equivalent to pretty much all of these is use effect. So yeah, and we'll get to that again later on. I think that's everything. So let's go ahead and actually let's actually start messing around with this React app. So again, in here, how do I start my React app? Like how do I actually spin up the server and get it going?
npm start.
All right, npm start.
Or yarn start, either.
Or yarn start. I've never used yarn before. I just use npm. But yeah. So if I come over here, it says starting development server. And I got that npm start from this script right here. npm start runs that React script start. And here we go. And there we go. Here's our React app. So let's kind of inspect what's going on. So in this public, we have our favicon, which is that React, which shows up here. We have the index.html. You can see right here, we have this div.root, or div with an ID of root. It just has like some no script. You need to enable JavaScript to run this app. We have some logos that we're injecting. We have this manifest. I forgot what this explicitly is used for. I think this allows us to inject this favicon logo and this other stuff into our source directory. Don't quite remember specifically though. You don't really have to worry about it. And then this robots text. I have no idea what that is. So you won't really be touching anything in the public directory, but in here we have the index.js directory or file, where we're importing React DOM, and this is where we're actually rendering this app component and we're injecting it into this get element by ID root. In this React strict mode, I forgot what this explicitly does. I think this has something to do with debugging. I think it allows you to debug a little bit better, but it's not necessarily required. This web report or report web vitals, I think this is kind of new. I'm not 100% sure. I think it just allows like to report certain web attributes to like Google Chrome and like how many users and all that stuff are using your application, but not really sure what this is. But you don't really need to worry about that now or at all. And now we have our app.js file right here. That's what is actually being displayed on the screen. Does anybody have any questions about the app, this React app?
I have a question about master. So you have master on the terminal, like where it comes from.
Right here?
Yeah, this one, master.
Yep. What's your question? Sorry.
I mean, I know it's branch, but like when did you go to the branch? I missed it.
So I actually didn't. So when I initially installed, when I did npx create React app in the name of my app, when it ended up installing everything, it ended up making an initial Git repository and an initial commit. So this was created for me when I npx installed or npx create React app. That help answer?
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome, cool. So if I just start the app again. So I'm just gonna make sure it's good. All right, so reloading. I always kind of do a hard refresh because I know, as you saw in Quinn's app, it didn't like do a hard refresh automatically, or it took a long time. So I usually will manually do a hard refresh. So we're gonna create an app that like a counter app, kind of what Quinn did. Has anybody heard of the app Cookie Clicker? We're going to create, is it Cookie Clicker? I forgot which one it is. Yeah. So there's literally a website that literally the game is just how many times you can click this cookie. This is all this app is. And I don't know how much money it makes. I think it makes quite a lot of money. And this is all it does. It's just through advertisements, little like application, Patreon. So this little app makes $2,000 a month just via Patreon, but it also has all this other advertisements. So we're going to kind of create something that literally just clicks a counter that goes up. So, as I mentioned before, React is getting away from class-based components and going into functional-based components. So the initial component app is, in fact, a functional-based component. So I'm just going to remove this and just say H1. I have been clicked X times. I'm going to create a button here that says click me. I'm going to indent this like so, just to keep things. So if I refresh this, there it goes. It says I've been clicked X times. And let's actually create this. Let's convert this to a, actually let's first keep it like this. Let's keep it in a functional based component. But I don't like it. I don't like writing functions like this anymore. I'm actually going to create a fat arrow function. So again, this is just like a normal function I can create however I want, and it's still going to work. But instead of, so in place of I've been clicked X times, I want to create some state. And when I click this button, I want it to update state and display it right here. So in a functional based component, how do I create a state in a functional based component? Does anybody remember from this morning?
Is this where you would build the array?
Build the array. What do you
Yeah,
mean
where
by
you
that?
would make the array variable, the variable, I don't remember the syntax.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah. So the first thing I need to do, I need to import the use state hook from React. So I can say import use state from React. And now for state, this use state hook takes in one argument, but it returns two values. So it returns, I'm going to return the count, which is the state, as well as a method called set count. And that equals the use state method, and the initial value is 0. So the use state hook returns two values. One is the value of the state, which is extracted through here, this count, and then also a method that is used to update the count, because I'm unable to update the state, which is count, just by accessing count. I need another way to update count, because if I try to mutate count directly, there can be some weird functionality and weird bugs that come out. So this set count method, which I can call anything I want, will update this count state. But best practice, call it set count. So this initial value is 0. Now, how do I put this in place of X? So how do I put this initial value of count in place of X?
Braces.
So braces just like that, and I can just call count. So it's recompiling. If I come up here, it says I've been clicked 0 times. All right. So now, I want to create a function that updates this state or this count variable. So I can say on click. Again, in HTML, there's on click as an actual attribute. And I can say like handle button click. Now it says, oh, we got an error. Handle button click is not defined. So I need to create a variable or a function, handle button click, that actually updates this count method. So again, this is just another function I'm creating in here. So const handle button click. I don't need to accept any values. I can do, in order to update the count, I can say set count. What is it? Set count. Can I do count plus 1? See if that works. What questions do you have so far? So I created this. Oh, go ahead.
Do you always want to put it inside of the app function, or would you put it outside? Or like, I was just wondering what the best practice.
So if this handle button click is local to this component, this app component, meaning it's not this specific function is not going to be used outside of this component at all, it should always exist within the component. If you're creating a helper function that might be used in a bunch of different components, then you might want to declare like a helper function app or a helper function file that you create all your helper function and store all your helper functions in. So if I come over here and says click me, look, it's working. If I refresh, goes down to 0. There we go. And I can also do like the previous count. Previous count. I just want to see if this works. Disregard. All right. So we have the count plus 1. And so if I click it a bunch of times, that's great. Now it's working. All right. Let's keep going. So that's all great and everything. But what if I wanted to create a button clicker a bunch of times? So if I wanted to create this functionality and replicate it a bunch of times throughout my application, I can actually create a component that literally does the same thing. So in here, in my source directory, I'm going to create another directory called components. Inside of that directory, this is just kind of best practice. I'm going to create buttons, a buttons component or a buttons directory. And inside my buttons, I'm going to create a default button.js. So I'm going to extract all of this pretty much outside of the button, outside of the app component, and put it into its own component called default button, and then import the default button into here as a component and just render the default button component. So I'm going to create, should I create a class-based component or a functional-based component here? I can create either or, doesn't matter. Does anybody have a preference? All right, I'll create a functional-based component, and then I'll switch it, and I'll do the same thing and create a class-based component. So what's cool about VS Code, I just created the architecture for a functional-based component. So I can do RSC. It says create a stateless React component without prop types and ES6 module system, blah, blah. These are React.js code snippets. And I can just type it RSC, and it just automatically creates the skeleton of a functional-based component. So with that, I can extract all of this to here. And then I can also import use state. And I'm also copying over all of that. So now that I've created this default button, I can go ahead and delete all of this stuff in my app.js. And in here, I just want to render the default button component. And it automatically, so I'm also importing default button from components, buttons, default button. So if I come back here, it still works. What questions do you have about that?
Could it be pretty common on app.js to have several import components, like import statements at the top?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
So you sorry. So you split it, and now you can go ahead and copy default button again. So you can create like a lot of them.
Yep. Let's see what happens if I create, like, I don't know how many that is. So let's see what happens. Bam. So it just rendered all these different button components on here. But what happens when I click me? What do you think is going to happen if I say, like, click me down here? Are they all going to increase by 1, or is only that individual component going to increase by 1? Any guesses?
All of them.
All of them. Let's see what
Individual
happens.
component.
They all are unique. So it doesn't matter. So again, each one of these default button components, the current state is confined to this individual component. So this default component state is going to be different than the very bottom's default button state, because they're different instances almost. It's rendering the default button function multiple times. So each one is unique. So that's how you can render this, the same component, but with different data passed in. Like 4 hour, 1.5 hour, etc. What questions do you have so far?
So if you wanted to make it take in different data, you would make it maybe take like an argument that would change like how it's incremented or something.
So I can say, yeah, so let's actually do that. Let's kind of go off a little. I'm going to delete some of these. And I'm going to pass in some props. Does anybody remember how Quinn passed in props to a component? So before I do that, I'm just going to console log count here. So if I console log count right here, and if I go to my React app and open up the Chrome DevTools and go to console, I get the count rendered 3 different times when I first re-render it. So anyway, so you can console log in a function and have it show up in the console. So back to my original point, how do I pass in like an incremental? So instead of going up by 1, say I want to go up by 2 for this one, up by 5 for this one, and up by 10 for this one. Is there a way I can do that?
You just pass it in inside those brackets.
Yep, exactly. I can do like increment. I can call this whatever I want and have it be, what is it? Did I say 2? Say 2. Say this is 5. And this is 10. Now, if I refresh here, nothing gets displayed here. Now, how do I access this increment prop type, or this prop, in the default button function?
Would you have to import prop and then set its parent as prop or props or something?
So this default button can take in an argument of props. So before I do that, I'm just going to console log props. If I refresh that, oh, it broke. It says props is not defined. It's because I'm not passing anything in. Again, this is a function. Think of it as a normal function. It doesn't know what props is. So let me pass in props as an argument. If I refresh here, I get props that show up here for each individual component. So the first one, the increment, it's got an increment, comes in as an object, has an increment keyword with a value of 2, has an increment. So the second component right here is passing in a prop equal to 5. And then the third component right here is passing in an increment prop that's equal to 10. So on this handle button click, I can actually access props by doing prop dot increment. I think this might work. Let's see if this works. This might not work. So if I refresh that, so there we go. Increases by 2 each time, increases by 5 each time, increases by 10 each time. What questions do you have about props? And we're going to get into props a lot later on as well.
So is it what it's doing? It's passing increment inside of a props object? Is that how that
Correct.
works?
Yep. So props and state. Well, once we get into state, I'll show you what that looks like.
If you wanted to pass in multiple variables, you could just do a space and then another value equals blank. And those are all in that object that is passed into props.
Yep. So, so for the first one, if I console log props, if I refresh it, oh geez, what's happened? If I refresh, only the first component that I created has another prop called another prop. All the other ones just have this. Yeah. So if I wanted to create 100 different buttons, instead of, I can like do that like 100 times, or I can create a function. So out here, again, this is just another app is just a function. I'm going to create another function called create buttons and make it a fat arrow function. And I'm going to say let buttons equals an empty array. I'm going to do a for loop, let I equals 0. Whoop. I is less than 100, then I plus plus, and in the buttons array, I'm gonna push the default button component. Like so. At the very end of this function, I'm going to return buttons. Oh, what happened? Oh. There we go. So it's default button. Default button. Cool. So now in here, if I wanted to execute that function, create buttons, I can execute that function called create buttons, which returns an array of button components. And that array can be rendered on the screen 100 times. Uh-oh, not a number, because it's, there we go. What questions do you have so far? about this.
I have one, Tom.
Yep, go ahead.
The default button component inside of the buttons.push, that is actually just markup, right? That's just matched up, will be matched up based on if the app finds a component with default button name.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you're doing the create buttons, that function is returning an array of the default buttons, and you said those were like instances, but
No, they're just, it's an array of components.
why does it look like that on the web page when it's an array of default buttons?
Just because the way JSX interprets that.
Okay, all right.
All right.
So if we had an array of different components, like it would still be able to parse through the array even though like the components are different?
Yeah. Yep. All right. So we've just created two functional-based components. But let's convert these both to class-based components. Or let's convert this one to a class-based component first. Because you're going to be running and you're going to be doing this a lot the next few challenges. So the first thing I need to do is do class app extends component. Whoop. There we go. I have to import the component class from React. And now in here, I need to do that render method. And the render method returns, return that JSX right here. Whoa. There we go. But now for this create buttons function, if I wanted to do that, how do I create a function in a class? Does anyone remember?
You just use the name of the function.
Yep. So just use the name of the function. And now I can literally probably just copy over this portion of it. Like so. Let's see if everything still works. Oh, we got an error. Create buttons. There we go. All right, let's refresh this. So go, create buttons is not defined. What am I missing in this class? Again, it's different than a function, it's a class. How do I access,
This?
What's that?
Maybe you need to use this.
Yep. So again, this is a class. This is a instance method. In order to access that instance method, I can say this create buttons. And there we go. And in here it says each list of child should have a unique key prop. So I can literally just say like key I. That should get rid of that warning. There we go. Anyway. Questions about converting a functional-based component to a class-based component.
What does the key do, Tom?
That's just like mainly an HTML thing. If you're repeating a bunch of same divs, essentially, each unique or each element in the HTML should have like a key, a unique key value. So that's what that's about. But it won't break your code. It's a warning. So anytime you're using creating a bunch of elements such as default buttons. Just have a unique key that identifies each part of HTML or JSX. All right. So let's actually go ahead and create this default button. So everything still works. One's a class component, one's a functional based component. Let's go ahead and convert this default button into a class based component. So what do I need? I need to say class default button extends component. And I'm going to need the render method because that's always what's called. Then I need to return, open that up, and I'm going to return this div. I'm going to format the document just to make sure everything's pretty. And now I need to declare state. Oh, I need it. How do I declare state in a function or in a class-based component?
Constructor?
I could create a constructor. So if I wanted to, I can do constructor. So I can create a constructor in my class if I wanted to. But how do I declare state? How do I create a new state object?
State equals object.
State equals an object. And let's call this one count equals 0. I have a constructor here. I don't necessarily need it, but I could have it here if I wanted to. It's not necessary, but I could have it here. So in here, all right, let's see what's happening. So refreshing. What else do I need? So it says state is not defined, count is not defined. Why isn't that?
Do you have to put const or that in front of state?
No, I think I might need this dot state. See if that works. I didn't think I needed that. Yeah, it's actually called this dot state. So I get that error to go away, hopefully. Uh-oh. So I have an error. It says reference must call super constructor in derives class before accessing this, returning from derived constructor. So remember in when you're inheriting from another class, they would call this super. I think this might, yeah. So this is kind of like you're passing props into here and you're calling the super, which is the parent component. But again, you don't necessarily need any of this. So I can go ahead and actually delete this stuff. Oh. Let's see if this works. So again, it says count is not defined. How do I access count from state? And this dot state dot count. See if I get rid of that error. Come on, refreshing. All right, so it's still not, it's broken, but it's one less error. So handle button click is not defined. So I need to create a handle button click method inside of this here. So again, similar to the create buttons, I can say handle button click. equals fat arrow function. And it's wise to use the fat arrow functions when creating methods inside of components. And so in here, again, I can just say, how do I change state? How do I change the count value of state inside my handle button click? Does anybody remember? So just like in a functional based component, it comes with, we extract this set count method that we call to change the state. In class based components, you can't change state directly, like this state.count plus equals 1. You can't do that. They have this method called this dot set state, which when we invoke it, we invoke the new value of state. So we can say count equals this dot state dot count, which is the old value, plus 1. And then in order to actually call the handle button click inside of a class component, we need to run the this keyword in front of it. Oh, doesn't equal. Again, this is an object. So there we go. So if I, again, refresh it, everything still works. I'm not getting any errors. I'm rendering this I've been clicked 100 different times. What questions do you have about React, functional based components versus class based components, and or anything else?
If you wanted to pass an argument with the class-based one, how would the process change?
So in here, let's see. So I'm just going to comment this out and go back to a functional based component. And instead of rendering all the create buttons, I'm just going to create one. It sucks. I'm going to create one default button and say increment again and say 5. So if I want to pass in props in here, so in class-based components, you can't just console log anywhere you want in the component or in the class. Because again, this is a class. You can't just like console log in the middle of a class. You have to console log within functions within the class. So notice how it's giving me errors. So it's like here, it's like console log, like it doesn't know what this is. So if I want to console log in a class-based component, have it be within the render method. So if I come over here, so there we go, I'm console logging anywhere right there. So in here, I can access this dot props. Let's see if I have access to this. So there we go. So I'm passing in a prop of increment to 5. I automatically have it, access to it in the default button class component by calling this dot props. So the props is always automatically passed down into the class automatically. And I can access it by calling this dot props. So in here, if I wanted to actually access it, this dot props dot increment. If I refresh it, there we go. Did that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
Awesome. Any more questions? All right. With that, I'm going to